Mark Vargas, thank you for joining us from Chicago. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Terry.
We wanted to talk to you. You are a spokesman for the Blagojevich family about former Governor Rod Blagojevich, who has been in prison now approximately 7 years already of what is a 14-year sentence, and what your efforts and the efforts of others are ongoing as far as trying to see if he can be released early. And we wanted to see if you could give us an update on what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Sure, of course. Well, you know, the governor has already served 7 years and 7 months of a 14-year sentence, and you know, the family is incredibly grateful to President Trump for his consideration, and so we remain very, very hopeful that the president will sign that paperwork and send the governor back home to be with his family.
What do you say to those who said the governor deserves to spend every day of his sentence in jail?
Sure. Well, you know, they're obviously allowed to think that, but let's look at a couple of things. Number one, Rod Blagojevich was given a sentence that's one of the longest prison sentences in the history of our country for an elected official, 14 years. Bernie Kerik, the former New York City police commissioner, who's been very supportive and has been advocating for Rod's release, he talked about that Rod's prison sentence of 14 years is actually longer than the prison sentence handed down to a convicted terrorist who was plotting a mass murderer. So across the board, you know, President Trump has triggered a tsunami wave of bipartisan support for the governor's release. And so we've got Eric Holder, for example, the former attorney general under Barack Obama. He's on record saying that Rod's 14-year sentence didn't make sense to him. Senator Dick Durbin, right here in Illinois, has been on record numerous times talking about that Rod Blagojevich's 14-year sentence was outrageous, it was excessive, and it didn't make sense to him. You know, Reverend Jackson's been very supportive, and he wrote that letter along with Congressman Jackson to the president advocating for his release, that 14-year sentence is just too long. And so we've had just incredible support from not only Senator Durbin and Eric Holder and Reverend Jackson, but you know, Bernie Kerik, former New York City police commissioner, many members of Illinois' Democratic congressional delegation, both current and former members of Illinois' Democratic congressional delegation. So we have a lot of bipartisan support, not only here in Illinois, but across the country, that all in unison believe that that 14-year sentence was just excessive.
As we tape this on October 24, the president's coming to Chicago to speak to the International Association of Chiefs of Police on Monday, October 28th. Do you have any access to the president to make your case, or are you going through back channels? Or I don't know if there's any coincidence between your efforts to get former Governor Blagojevich released. And do you have any inclination as far as what the president thinks on this issue? We should remind the viewers, by the way, that Rod Blagojevich was on the president's television show, The Apprentice, so they know each other. And I believe before the president became president, he had said publicly that he thought Rod Blagojevich had been sentenced to too long of a term.
Well, President Trump has been very consistent going all the way back to 2012. On the day that Rod Blagojevich reported to prison, then private citizen Donald Trump tweeted, "It's outrageous that Rod Blagojevich is sentenced to 14 years in prison while rapists and murderers are out walking the streets. ... Is this justice? I don't think so." And then in 2015, as a candidate for president, right here in Chicago, before the Chicago Tribune editorial board meeting, he reiterated that sentiment, that Rod Blagojevich's prison sentence was way too long, that he didn't deserve 14 years in prison. And then in May 31st, 2018, aboard Air Force One, and then aboard Air Force One just a couple of months ago. So the president has been consistent that he believed that Rod Blagojevich's prison sentence was too long and that it was outrageous. The president is coming to Chicago this Monday, first time since 2015 when he was a candidate, first time as president, and he's got two events on his calendar. Number one is he's going to give a keynote speech at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, where he's going to be talking about historic legislation that he signed, the First Step Act, reducing crime, reducing recidivism, and how that positively impacts communities, particularly here in Chicago. And then he's going to have a fundraiser at Trump Hotel. But we have not at this time set up any meetings or put in a request to meet with the president. I know that his schedule is hectic, and so, but we are in close communication with the White House. I remain in direct contact with Jared Kushner, and so the president, again, not only has he been consistent, but the president's going to make this decision, this final decision, when he's ready. But the family just remains incredibly grateful that Rod and his sentence and Patty and the girls have been on his radar.
How frequently do you communicate with the family and the former First Lady of Illinois?
I've become very, very good friends with Patty and the two girls, and so Patty and I talk all the time. Rod and Patty speak every night. He gets 300 minutes to call his family per month. And so he calls every night around 9 p.m. and they speak for 10 minutes. But he can also email. And so I exchange emails almost on a weekly basis with Rod, and I have for the last 16 months. In fact, I heard from him. I communicated with him this morning via email. And so not only do I like to talk about what's going on in Illinois politics, but I was updating him on the president's visit. We talk about the Cubs. We talk about a variety of different topics.
And how is the former governor's spirits, and to what extent is he thinking about the fact that perhaps he might be released early if President Trump so acts?
Well, he is very, very grateful, as is Patty and the girls, that the president has his consistency, again, going back to 2012. And he is grateful that the president has been thinking about commuting his sentence. He's grateful for the bipartisan support that has been generated thanks to President Trump for his commutation. In fact, WGN Radio put out a poll in August. Over 1,000 people voted, and 70% said Rod Blagojevich has served enough time, send him home. And I think that is remarkable because we've been seeing it, we've been feeling that bipartisan support, but now we've got the data thanks to that WGN poll. And it's remarkable when you think about in 2012, and I shared this with in an email with Rod yesterday. In 2012, he had an approval rating here in Illinois of 7%. In August of 2019, 70% of Illinoisans want to see him returned home. So, that lifts his spirits. The fact that he can communicate, he talks to Patty and to the girls every evening, that boosts his spirits. Talking about his Cubs boosts his spirits. So he is just incredibly grateful, and we're just waiting for the president to make that decision when he's ready.
Is the idea that would he be commuted and then go home? Would he go to a halfway house? What is the idea? And would he be free then to take up any job that would be offered to him, or are there some strings attached, or do we know?
Well, the way it's been explained to me is that once the president actually makes that decision, you could be released within hours. And Rod could be on a plane flying back home to Chicago. But there's one particular topic that Rod has become very, very passionate about over the last year or so, and one that we've emailed each other at great length about, and that is criminal justice reform. As a former member of Congress, as a former governor, and now as an inmate, he's had a unique perspective on sort of the conditions in prison, things that he's experienced and that he's witnessed. And so he has become very, very passionate, and he's become a very powerful advocate on behalf of criminal justice reform. And this isn't about him. This is about his other inmates. And in fact, we have a letter here that I've been given permission to share with you that Rod had written to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
If I might, Mark, I'll bring that up now, and if you want to read that portion.
This was on November 6th of last year, 2018. And so the background is that Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, was waffling about whether or not he was actually going to bring the First Step Act up for a vote in the Senate, because it had already unanimously passed the House many months earlier. And so there was a big effort and a push to try and get the Senate Majority Leader to bring the First Step Act for a vote so that it could pass and so the president could sign it. And so I talked to Rod about putting together a letter that I would make sure that would get in the hands of the Senate Majority Leader. And so I sent this letter to his office, and they confirmed receipt. And I also sent this letter to Jared Kushner, because I remain in direct communication with Jared Kushner. So I passed this letter to him, and I asked if Jared could pass that along to the president, and he said that that he would. But let me just read this letter. It is incredibly powerful. When Rod finished drafting this letter, and when he read it to his inmates, many of them started to cry. And finally, I have seen this issue of incarceration from both sides now. For the past nearly 7 years, I have served time with well over 1,000 inmates. A large number of these men are not bad men. I believe a lot of them, if given another chance, can do good. Most of them are younger men, in their 30s and 40s. But there are older men here too. I see them every day as they do their time and I do mine. I see them with their families in the visiting room when my wife and daughters visit me. Beneath their surface cheerfulness, I can sense the undercurrent of sadness. I recognize this and others because my family has it too. Many of the inmates have young children separated from their fathers. I see these children and I think of my own. In that same visiting room, I see mothers with their sons holding hands. Just a fleeting glance at the older woman at the table sitting across from the inmate tells you she is his mother. She reveals who she is by the sadness in her eyes. And I think that that kind of gives people a little bit of glimpse of Rod Blagojevich, not as the former governor now incarcerated, but Rod Blagojevich as an advocate for criminal justice reform. And so he has witnessed a lot. It's certainly changed him, things that he's been able to see. Rod's been there when a fellow inmate whose wife of 50 years passed away, and he was denied a furlough to attend her wake or funeral services. He's comforted individuals, fathers whose children have died in car accidents or whose children have committed suicide. He's comforted husbands whose slowly over time their families stop communicating with them until they receive a package in the mail with divorce paperwork. So he's comforted broken-hearted husbands. He's witnessed a fellow inmate collapse and die in prison. And when his body was loaded onto a gurney by the coroner, that he was still, they handcuffed him to the gurney as he was loaded into that van. And so a lot of these experiences change you. And that's why Rod has been so passionate about prison reform and criminal justice reform, because this legislation is historic. A couple of items, if some people aren't familiar with a couple of important pieces within this legislation that has been signed by the president and is now law, is number one, it provides funding for education opportunities so that there's more training, so that these inmates are more prepared when they go back into life outside of prison. It restores
is that the First Step program you're talking about?
The First Step Back. This is the First Step Back. It restores dignity back into our criminal justice system. Another thing that it does is, before the First Step Act was signed by the president, the Federal Bureau of Prisons was denying 94% of inmates requesting compassionate release. Compassionate release is when a non-violent inmate is diagnosed with a terminal illness and they're only giving days, weeks or months left to live. So instead of dying at home surrounded by loved ones, they were left to die alone and bedridden and behind bars. 94% of those compassionate release requests were denied. For the first time now, it's now law that women inmates are no longer chained and handcuffed to the hospital bed when they give birth in prison. Now inmates are required to be stationed within 500 miles of their family, so that allows the family unit to still stick together to keep that cohesiveness so that they can see their families, because a lot of inmates, their families can't afford to travel to see them wherever they might be. So these are just some really important aspects of the First Step Act that Rod has been passionately advocating for behind the scenes, and that's why it is so important that this legislation was signed by the president, and obviously the president's going to talk about the First Step Act on Monday here in Chicago.
Before time runs out, has the former governor indicated anything that does he have any idea of what he would do as far as making a living if he were released early?
Well, one of the things, again, as I just mentioned, he's very passionate about is he'd like to get involved with a couple of criminal justice reform organizations. He'd still like to continue to be a voice to the voiceless and address serious issues that we have in our country as it relates to sentence disparities. Why are African Americans serving sentences 3 or 4 times that of Caucasians for crack versus cocaine? Alice Marie Johnson is a perfect example. A life sentence in prison as a first-time nonviolent drug offender. You know, it's remarkable that you have individuals in prison that are serving life sentences for selling marijuana. Now marijuana is legal in 11 states. And so these are a lot of issues that Rod is passionate about and that he'd like to get involved in once he can hopefully return home after the president's commutation.
And Mark, I should have mentioned this earlier. How is it that you came to be the spokesman for the Blagojevich family? And tell the audience a little bit of your own background so they have some idea of who you are. Sure.
Well, I had reached out to Patty in the spring, early spring, after the United States Supreme Court did not take up Rod's case for a second time. And I just thought that his sentence was outrageous. I'm a Republican, but I thought that I could lend some help. And I thought that if there's any chance, it's going to take a Republican with Chicago roots who has pretty good relationships in the White House to try and make some noise. And so I've written several op-eds as a contributor to the Washington Examiner. And so this is something that I was very, very passionate about to get involved in, and not just Rod's case, but other cases as well. But my background is I'm born and raised in the Chicago suburbs, attended Judson University in Elgin. And September 11, 2001 was my lightning bolt moment. I was a sophomore. And I knew at that moment, on that day, that I wanted to serve my country in a cause bigger than myself. And so fast forward 2007, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I now have been hired to work on a special task force at the Pentagon, an Iraq task force, to help drive down terrorist-related activities through job creation and employment opportunities. And so from 2008 to 2010, I deployed to Baghdad, Iraq as a civilian advisor, was embedded with General Petraeus and his team when he was the commanding general. And so today I am a tech entrepreneur. I run a tech company in healthcare, and I'm involved in a lot of other interesting projects in Washington, whether it's healthcare reform, criminal justice reform, and so sort of a unique background with a variety of different projects that I'm working on. But you know, it's certainly an honor to be working with the Blagojevich family, pro bono, by the way, to see if we can get the governor's sentence commuted by the president.
I am going to bring up and ask people as we put this on our YouTube channel, and as well as we'll put it on other social media like Facebook. It would be good to have the viewers make your comment and let us know if you think former Governor Blagojevich should be released early and why, or just some of the other items that we've talked about in this comment. You can see on the screen there our YouTube channel address where you can go and watch not only the video, but also make your comments. Mark, as always, we thank you for taking the time. And as events develop in this case, hopefully we can revisit with you if there's something more new to report. We'll obviously be found it, and I'm sure given the Governor Blagojevich's reputation as well as the president, it'll be national news if something does break on this case.
No question about it. It will certainly generate a lot of activity.
Well, we thank you again, and good luck to you and all your endeavors, and say hello to Patty Blagojevich for us. Thank you.
I will do that. Thank you, Terry.